The value of the human being is considered here so be the principle of classification for the monetary system and as the determinate basis for the value of money. This is similar to the situation where the standard rate of wargild among the Bedouin whom Muhammad incorporated into Islam is 100 camels, and this rate is at the same time used as the typical ransom money for prisoners and also as dowry money. The same role of money is in evidence where fines are imposed not only for murder but for any offense. In the Merovingian period the solidus was no longer 40 but was only 12 denarii. One may speculate that the reason for this change was that the fine at that time imposed according to solidi should be reduced and it was decreed that whenever a solidus was required the fine should be no longer 40 but 12 denarii. From this there evolved the solidus fine of 12 denarii which finally became the generally accepted one. And it is reported that in the Palau Islands any kind of payment is simply called a fine. Here it is not the different coins that determine the scale against which the relative seriousness of the offense is measured, but rather the contrary, that the valuation of the offense creates a measure for establishing money values. This way of looking at things in so far as it relates to atonement for murder is based on a sentiment of general importance. Since the very essence of money rests upon quantity, since money in itself without the determining factor of how much is a completely empty concept, it is of the utmost importance and quite essential that each monetary system possesses a unit, the multiple or part of which represents each specific money value. This original determination without which no monetary system is possible, and which becomes technically refined as a standard of coinage, is, as it were, the absolute foundation for the quantitative relations in which money transactions operate. Conceptually speaking, of course, the size of this unit is quite irrelevant, for whatever it may be the necessary amount may be obtained by division or multiplication. Especially in later centuries, the fixing of this unit is actually only partly determined by historical political or by technical reasons with regard to the coinage. And yet, that amount of money that stands as the measure of all others whenever money is mentioned, and which is, as it were, the representative of money as a whole must have some relationship to man's central sense of value in order to be used as the equivalent for an object or performance that stands uppermost in his mind. This may also explain the often mentioned fact that in countries with a high monetary unit the cost of living is higher than in countries with a lower unit, thus, ceteris paribus, dearer in dollar countries than in mark countries, dearer in mark countries than in franc countries. The value of many necessities of life is expressed in these units or some multiple of them, regardless of their absolute size. Yet, both as a cause and a consequence, the monetary unit within a social circle nonetheless has profound relations with the economically explicable type of life values, no matter how irrelevant this unit seems to be because it can be divided and multiplied at will. It was as a consequence of this connection that the first French Constitution of 1791 adopted the daily wage as the standard of value. Every fully qualified citizen had to pay a direct tax of at least 3 days' work, and, in order to vote, required an income of 150 to 200 labor days. Thus, there emerged the notion in value theory that the absolute standard of value was equal to the daily necessities, that is, that which had the most basic value for men in relation to which precious metals and all money as commodities rose or fell in value. The suggestion of labor money as the basic unit that ought to be equal to the labor value of 1 hour or 1 day points in the same direction, namely of using a central limited object determined by an essential human interest as the unit of value. There is only a quantitative difference between this approach and using the equivalent of the human being, the wargild, as the basic money unit. The transition from the utilitarian to the objective and absolute valuation of the human being, the origin of wargild, is obviously purely utilitarian, and even though it does not altogether pertain to civil law, it nonetheless belongs to that state of indifference with regard to private and public law with which social development begins. The tribe, the clan and the family demanded a substitute for the economic loss which the death of one of its members implied and was willing to accept it instead of an impulsive vendetta. This transformation finally occurs in cases where the vendetta, which was supposed to be superseded, would itself be impossible. Among the Guajiro Indians, someone who accidentally hurt himself had to compensate his own family because he shed the blood of the family. Among some Malayan peoples it is common for the word for blood money to also mean, to get up, to stand up. It reflects the idea that by imposing blood money the slain person is resurrected for his people, that the void created by his death is filled again. In addition to the payment to relatives, a special payment for disturbing the peace of the community was imposed very early on, at least among the Germans. In the same vein, in some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms wergild for the family of the king was demanded a second time from the people for the life of their king. Similarly, wergild in India was transferred from the royal family to the Brahmins. In the light of such further developments of wergild, severed from its private economic origins, it contained from the very beginning an objective superindividual element since the amount was determined by custom and law, even though it differed according to social status. Thus the value of each person was fixed from birth onwards, quite regardless of his real value to his relatives. Not only was the person thereby valued as substance in contrast to the sum of his concrete achievements, but also the notion was introduced that he, by himself and not only for others, was worth such and such an amount. A characteristic transitional phenomenon from a subjective economic to an objective evaluation is illustrated in the following instance. In the Hebrew state of around the 3rd century, the regular price for a male slave was 50 shekel, for a female slave 30 shekel. But as atonement for the killing of a slave one had to pay 30 selah, almost twice the amount, since the Pentateuch maintained that the amount was 30 shekel and this was mistakenly considered to be 30 selah. They clung not to the calculable economic value of the damage done, but rather to a regulation that stemmed from non-economic sources which contrasted considerably in size as well as lack of differentiation with the former. The notion that the slave had a definite value, regardless of his utility to his owner, was not yet firmly established. Only the difference between the slave's price which expressed this utility and the atonement payment for killing him, even though brought about by a theological misinterpretation, suggested, nonetheless, that a specific economic value of a person might be derived from an objective order which revealed his valuation out of the merely private utility for those entitled to it. This transition is facilitated to the extent to which wergild becomes purely an institution of the state. In many cases the value of the legal oath was estimated to be proportional to the amount of the wergild. And it is significant that sometimes only the freeman has wergild, but not the serf. In the Middle Ages in the area around Florence we find many gradations of serfs as coloni, sedentes, quilini, inquilini, adscriptitii, censiti, etc., whose bondage was probably in reverse relation to their wergild so that there was no wergild at all for the totally dependent. Even as late as the 13th century such a long outdated and merely formal criterion was put forward before the courts in order to grade testimonies accordingly. From the standpoint of individualistic utility, wergild should have been maintained all the more strongly, the more someone was the property of a third person. The fact that it happened differently, and that the rank order functioned as a symbol for the weight to be attached to personal testimony, serves to underline the point at which wergild became an expression of the objective value of the person. This development, which elevated the valuation of man from a merely utilitarian to an objective price valuation, reflects a very common mode of thinking. If all human subjects receive one and the same impression of an object, then it seems to be explained only by the fact that the subject in itself possesses this specific quality that is the content of the impression. Very different impressions may, in their differentiation, originate in the subjects who absorb them, but the identity of impressions, if we exclude the most improbable chances, can spring only from the fact that the object of these qualities is reflected in our minds, while admitting of course that this is only a symbolic expression that requires further supplementation. Within the sphere of valuation, this process repeats itself. If the same object is valued differently in different cases and by different persons, then the whole valuation appears as a subjective process which consequently produces different results according to personal circumstances and dispositions. If, however, the object is valued equally by different persons, the conclusion seems unavoidable that the object is worth that much. If, therefore, the relatives of a murdered person demanded different amounts of wergild, then it was clear that they wanted to replace their personal loss.